Did you know that the Mojave Desert covers roughly 57,000 square miles across 4 states? That temperatures on its surface can exceed 150 degrees Fahrenheit on a summer afternoon, and that somewhere beneath that cracked and ancient Earth lies enough lithium to power every electric vehicle on the planet several times over? Most people think the Mojave is just a stretch of nothing between Las Vegas and Los Angeles. They are spectacularly wrong. Here are 32 facts about the Mojave Desert that will completely rewrite everything you thought you knew about this place. Fact number 32. The Mojave is not actually a hot desert. This surprises almost everyone. When people hear the word desert, they picture sweltering heat around the clock, every single day of the year. But scientists classify the Mojave as a high desert, and that distinction matters enormously. The elevation across much of the Mojave ranges from 2,000 to 5,000 feet above sea level, and in winter the temperatures regularly plunge below freezing. Snow falls on the Mojave, real snow, not a dusting, but actual accumulating snowfall that blankets the Joshua trees and the creosote flats in white. The Mojave sits at the intersection of the Great Basin Desert to the north and the Sonoran Desert to the south, creating a climate zone unlike either of those neighbors. It gets cold enough to freeze and hot enough to kill, sometimes within the same week. The United States Geological Survey officially classifies it as a transitional desert, meaning it carries the biological and climatic fingerprints of multiple desert ecosystems simultaneously. If you ever drove through it in January and felt genuinely cold, you were not imagining it. The Mojave was telling you exactly what it is. Fact number 31. There is a river in the Mojave that flows underground for most of its length. The Mojave River is one of the strangest waterways in North America. It begins in the San Bernardino Mountains, flows north and east through the desert, and then simply vanishes. Not into a lake, not over a waterfall, but straight down into the sand. For stretches of 40 miles or more, the Mojave River exists entirely beneath the surface, flowing through layers of alluvial sediment while the ground above appears bone dry. Indigenous Mojave people knew about this river for thousands of years and built their lives around it, understanding intuitively where the water ran underground and where it could be accessed. Spanish explorers who crossed this region in the early 1800s were baffled by it, and some of them nearly died of thirst while walking directly above flowing water. The underground portions of the Mojave River represent a critical aquifer system that today supplies water to communities across San Bernardino County. During the wettest years, the river actually resurfaces in certain sections, briefly becoming visible before going underground again. It is a river that plays hide and seek with the sky. Fact number 30. The Joshua tree is technically not a tree at all. This one always gets a reaction. Those iconic, twisted, reaching shapes that define the visual identity of the Mojave Desert, the ones that appear on album covers and in road trip photographs, the ones that gave a famous national park its name, those are not trees. Joshua trees belong to the genus Yucca, which places them in the family Asparagaceae, making them relatives of asparagus and agave rather than oaks or pines. They are monocots, meaning they grow differently from true trees, lacking the rings inside their trunks that allow researchers to date ordinary timber. Scientists estimate the age of Joshua trees by measuring their height and calculating growth rates. But this is imprecise because growth rates vary wildly depending on water availability. Some Joshua trees in the Mojave are believed to be over 500 years old. The tallest ones reach around 40 feet. They can only be pollinated by a single species, the yucca moth, meaning the fate of the Joshua tree is biologically linked to the fate of that one insect. Climate projections published by researchers at the University of California suggest that by the end of this century, suitable habitat for Joshua trees could be reduced by as much as 90% in their current range. What looks like a permanent feature of the Mojave landscape may be quietly disappearing. Fact number 29. The United States military owns more of the Mojave than any other single entity. This is not common knowledge outside of defense circles, but it is staggering when you lay it out. Military installations across the Mojave include Edwards Air Force Base, which covers more than 300,000 acres and serves as the primary location where the Air Force tests experimental aircraft. Fort Irwin, home of the National Training Center, covers another 640,000 acres and simulates full-scale battlefield environments. Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Center at 29 Palms is the largest United States Marine Corps base in the world by area, stretching across 930,000 acres of Mojave landscape. When you add the China Lake Naval Air Weapons Station, which controls another 1,100,000 acres, the total military footprint in the Mojave becomes mind-bending. The military controls more land in the Mojave Desert than the entire state of Delaware contains. This concentration exists because the desert offers something that almost no other environment in the contiguous United States can provide, which is enormous empty space where you can test weapons, fly experimental aircraft, conduct live-fire exercises, and generally do things that require a very large buffer zone between the activity and the nearest human beings. Fact number 28. Death Valley, the hottest place ever recorded on Earth, sits within the Mojave. On July 10, 1913, a thermometer at Furnace Creek in Death Valley registered 134 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade. That number has stood as the official world record for air temperature for over a century, though it has been disputed by some meteorologists who question the reliability of measurement equipment that old. What is not disputed is the ground surface temperature at Death Valley, which during summer regularly exceeds 200 degrees Fahrenheit. You could literally cook food on that ground. The valley sits 282 feet below sea level, the lowest point in North America, and the surrounding mountains trap heat inside the basin the way an oven traps heat inside its chamber. The Panamint Range to the west rises to 11,000 feet, ensuring that any moisture-bearing air from the Pacific loses virtually all its water before descending into the valley. Annual precipitation at Furnace Creek averages less than 2 inches. For context, the Sahara Desert receives about 3 inches per year. Death Valley is drier than the Sahara. Despite this, Death Valley National Park receives around 1 million visitors every single year. Fact number 27. The Mojave contains the ruins of an entire vanished sea. About 500 million years ago, a shallow inland sea covered what is now the American Southwest, and the Mojave Desert preserves evidence of that sea in ways that feel almost impossible when you are standing on sun-baked rock. Fossil beds across the region contain trilobites, ancient marine worms, and the skeletal remains of creatures that existed before the age of dinosaurs. The Marble Mountains fossil beds in the Mojave National Preserve have yielded some of the most complete Cambrian-era fossils found anywhere in the American West. When paleontologists work in these sites, they are essentially excavating an ancient ocean floor that now sits at elevation in one of the hottest places in North America. The transition from seafloor to desert happened over geological timescales involving mountain building, continental drift, and the progressive drying of a vast region that once teemed with marine life. Standing on Mojave Rock and knowing that you are standing on the compressed remains of an ocean is one of those facts that rewire something in your brain permanently. Fact number 26. There is a musical road in the Mojave that plays the William Tell Overture when you drive over it. Near the city of Lancaster in California, engineers from Honda cut a series of grooves into the asphalt at precise intervals, calculated to produce musical tones when a car drives over them at the posted speed of 55 miles per hour. The grooves vibrate the tires and the car frame, and the car itself essentially becomes the instrument. Honda originally built this road as an advertisement in 2008, but it became so popular with locals and tourists that it was rebuilt and maintained as a permanent novelty. However, the story of the musical road has a strange wrinkle. The original road was built in the wrong location, in a residential neighborhood, and neighbors were so disturbed by the constant noise of cars trying to hear the song that the road was paved over and rebuilt in a more isolated spot. It is entirely possible to drive through the Mojave Desert and hear the Lone Ranger theme playing through your car's floor. This is a thing that exists. Now, before we go further, I want to ask you something. Out of everything you have heard so far, which fact landed hardest? Because I have to tell you, when I first started digging into the Mojave for this video, The military land ownership numbers genuinely stopped me cold. I had driven through this desert a dozen times and had no idea that I was essentially driving through the edges of a massive interlocking military empire. If you are finding this as wild as I did when I first researched it, hit that subscribe button right now because we are only halfway through and the facts get considerably stranger from here. Fact number 25. The Mojave Desert is home to one of the world's most significant deposits of rare earth minerals and lithium. Rare earth elements are the building blocks of modern technology, appearing in everything from smartphones to fighter jet guidance systems to wind turbines. The Mojave's geology concentrates these materials in ways that have made the region strategically critical. The Mountain Pass Mine in San Bernardino County was once the world's largest rare earth mining operation and provided the overwhelming majority of global rare earth supply through the 1980s and 90s. After environmental issues and competition from Chinese producers caused it to shut down for years, rising demand for materials used in electric vehicle batteries and green energy technology drove a major revival. The lithium deposits in the Mojave region, particularly around Searles Lake and Panamint Valley, are considered some of the most concentrated in the Western Hemisphere. As the global economy shifts away from fossil fuels, the ground beneath this remote desert is becoming one of the most economically valuable pieces of real estate on the planet. According to reporting by the United States Geological Survey, domestic rare earth production is now considered a matter of national security. Fact number 24. The Mojave Desert was once covered in massive lakes. During the last ice age, which ended roughly 11,000 years ago, the climate of the American Southwest was dramatically wetter and cooler than it is today. Ancient Lake Manly filled what is now Death Valley to a depth of 600 feet. Lake Mojave covered the region around Baker, California. Lake Bonneville, the ancestor of today's Great Salt Lake, stretched far enough south to touch the northern edges of the Mojave ecosystem. The shorelines of these ancient lakes are still visible as horizontal lines etched into the walls of desert valleys, ghost marks of a world that seems completely disconnected from the bleached landscape you see today. As the climate warmed and dried, these lakes evaporated over thousands of years, leaving behind salt flats, dry lake beds called playas, and concentrated mineral deposits that are still being mined today. The Mojave River once fed some of these ancient lakes, meaning that the underground river we discussed earlier is itself a remnant of a much larger and wetter hydrological system that no longer exists in any surface form. The desert is essentially a lake cemetery. Fact number 23. The Mojave Desert was a major corridor for one of the most dangerous migration routes in American history. The Old Spanish Trail blazed through the Mojave in the 1820s, and later the route followed by immigrants heading to California during the Gold Rush cut directly through the most lethal sections of Mojave terrain. The Mojave Road, used by both Spanish traders and American settlers, was marked not by signs but by the bones of animals and sometimes people who did not make it. The stretch between present-day Needles and the Cajon Pass was particularly brutal, offering almost no reliable water for stretches approaching 90 miles. Historical accounts collected by researchers at the Huntington Library describe immigrants traveling at night to avoid the heat, burying companions who died of thirst and heat exhaustion, and making desperate decisions about which direction to go based on rumors passed between strangers. The Mojave killed immigrants in numbers that were never fully counted. Mass graves have been discovered by archaeologists working in remote sections of the desert, their occupants still largely unidentified. The road to California ran straight through death. Fact number 22. Edwards Air Force Base in the Mojave was where Chuck Yeager broke the sound barrier for the first time. On October 14, 1947, test pilot Chuck Yeager climbed into the Bell X-1 rocket plane, was dropped from a Boeing B-29 bomber at an altitude of 45,000 feet over the Mojave Desert, fired the rocket engine, and punched through Mach 1 for the first time in recorded history. The sound of that barrier breaking rolled across the Mojave as a thunderclap that people on the ground heard without understanding what they were listening to. In the years that followed, the dry lakebed runways of Edwards proved to be the ideal testing ground for almost every significant American aircraft development of the 20th century. The X-15 hypersonic rocket plane, which reached the edge of space and flew at speeds above Mach 6, was tested here. Early space shuttle landings were conducted on the Rogers Dry Lake at Edwards. The aircraft tested above the Mojave changed the course of warfare, aviation, and space exploration. The desert absorbed the sonic booms and kept the secrets. Fact number 21. The Mojave contains a forest of trees that predate the birth of Christ by thousands of years. The ancient bristlecone pine forest, located in the White Mountains on the eastern edge of the Mojave region, is home to the oldest known living organisms on Earth. The oldest individual tree, known as Methuselah, is estimated at over 4,800 years old, meaning it germinated around 2,800 years before the birth of Christ, roughly contemporaneous with the construction of the Great Pyramid at Giza. For decades, the exact location of Methuselah was kept secret by the United States Forest Service to protect it from vandalism. Bristlecone pines survive by doing almost nothing quickly. They grow barely 1 inch of girth per century in some cases. The wood is so dense and resin-saturated that it resists insects, fungus, and rot almost indefinitely. Dead bristlecone logs lying on the ground in the White Mountains have been dated to tens of thousands of years old. These trees survive precisely because their environment is so hostile, growing in rocky, nutrient-poor soil at elevations above 10,000 feet, where competition from other plants is minimal. The harshest conditions on Earth have produced the oldest life on Earth. Fact number 20. The Mojave Desert is louder than most cities. This one seems backwards. The Mojave is empty, remote, and seemingly silent. Yet, acoustic researchers who have studied natural soundscapes consistently find that the desert is filled with sound at frequencies humans often cannot hear. Wind moving across rock formations produces infrasound, low-frequency vibrations below the threshold of human hearing that can travel for hundreds of miles. Certain sand dunes in the Mojave, particularly in the Kelso Dunes area of the Mojave National Preserve, produce a phenomenon called singing sands. When conditions are right, the movement of sand grains creates a resonance that sounds like a low, sustained hum or a distant engine. Early explorers described the sound as coming from underground, as though the desert itself were breathing. The booming dunes at Kelso can produce sounds loud enough to be heard from over a mile away. Researchers from the California Institute of Technology have studied this phenomenon and determined that it results from the synchronized movement of dry sand grains at the surface layer, each grain's vibration contributing to a collective resonance that amplifies into something genuinely audible and genuinely strange. Fact number 19. The Mojave has been the site of multiple nuclear weapons tests with lasting consequences. While most people associate nuclear testing in the American Southwest with the Nevada test site, which technically overlaps the northern Mojave ecosystem, the contamination from those tests spread far beyond any official boundary. From 1951 to 1992, the United States government conducted 928 nuclear tests at the Nevada test site, many of them in the atmosphere during the early years of the program. Radioactive fallout from those tests was carried by wind across the Mojave and beyond. Residents of communities downwind, including areas of Nevada, Utah, and the eastern Mojave, reported elevated rates of cancer and other illnesses in the decades that followed. These people became known as downwinders. Activists and affected families pressed for recognition for decades before the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act of 1990 was passed, providing limited compensation to some victims. The relationship between the American government and the communities of the Mojave region during the nuclear testing era is one of the most troubling chapters in the history of the American West. Fact number 18. The Mojave is experiencing an ecological transformation driven by an unlikely invader. Saharan mustard is a flowering plant native to North Africa and the Middle East that was accidentally introduced to the Mojave Desert in the 1920s, likely through contaminated agricultural seed shipments. It has since spread across millions of acres of Mojave Desert floor, outcompeting native plants and fundamentally altering the fire ecology of the desert. The Mojave Desert historically experienced very few fires because native plants like creosote and Joshua trees grow so far apart that fire cannot spread easily between them. Saharan mustard grows densely and creates a continuous mat of dry vegetation that burns readily, turning the Mojave into a fire-prone landscape in ways it never historically was. When these fires burn through Mojave plant communities, Joshua trees and native species are killed and replaced not by native recovery, but by more Saharan mustard. Researchers at the United States Geological Survey studying the problem have described it as one of the most significant ecological threats facing the Mojave Desert ecosystem today. An accident from a century ago is quietly rewriting the desert's biology. Fact number 17. Somewhere in the Mojave, there is a perfectly intact ghost town that was abandoned almost overnight. Calico, California was a silver mining boomtown that grew from nothing to a population of over 3,500 people in the 1880s, complete with a newspaper, saloons, schools, and hotels. Then, the price of silver collapsed following the repeal of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act in 1893, and within a few years, Calico was nearly empty. By 1907, it was a ghost town. Walter Knott, the founder of Knott's Berry Farm Amusement Park in California, purchased Calico in the 1950s and funded a partial restoration, eventually donating it to San Bernardino County. Today, Calico exists as a kind of tourist ghost town, where some buildings are original and others are reconstructed. But the silver mines are still there, and the geology that drew miners to this spot has never changed. The hills around Calico still contain silver, along with deposits of boron and other minerals. Calico is not just a relic. It is a reminder of how completely and how fast economic forces can hollow out a community built on resource extraction. Fact number 16. The Mojave Desert is home to a tortoise that has existed virtually unchanged since before the Rocky Mountains were formed. The desert tortoise, Gopherus agassizii, has been present in the Mojave region for an estimated 2 million years, a time frame that predates the modern configuration of the American West. These tortoises spend 95% of their lives underground, retreating into burrows during both the extreme heat of summer and the cold of winter, emerging only during brief windows of temperate weather in spring and fall. They can survive for up to a year without access to water, obtaining moisture almost entirely from the plants they eat. Desert tortoises live for between 50 and 80 years in the wild, and some individuals have been documented living past 80 years in captivity. The United States Fish and Wildlife Service listed the Mojave population of the desert tortoise as threatened under the Endangered Species Act in 1990. The primary threats are habitat destruction from development, military activities, disease, and vehicle strikes. A creature that survived the rise of mountains and the evaporation of ancient lakes is being undone by car tires and expanding suburbs. Fact number 15. The Mojave Desert played a central role in the development of the American space program in ways that go beyond aircraft testing. The Goldstone Deep Space Communications Complex, operated by the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and located in the Fort Irwin area of the Mojave, has been communicating with spacecraft since 1958. The massive dish antennas at Goldstone track the Pioneer and Voyager probes as they left the solar system, receive data from Mars landers and orbiters, and remain part of the deep space network that maintains contact with spacecraft now billions of miles from Earth. The Mojave Air and Spaceport, a civilian facility in Kern County, was the launch point for Spaceship One, the first privately funded spacecraft to reach space, which accomplished that feat on June 21, 2004. Burt Rutan's Scaled Composites Company, which built Spaceship One, was based at Mojave Air and Spaceport, and numerous other commercial space ventures have used the facility. The Mojave Desert is both the place where American military aviation pushed past the sound barrier and the place where private spaceflight was born. Fact number 14. The Mojave contains more than 1,000 known archaeological sites belonging to the ancestral Mojave and other indigenous peoples. The human history of the Mojave Desert extends back at least 10,000 years based on archaeological evidence recovered from sites across the region. The Mojave people, known as the Pipa Aha Makav, or the people who live along the water, built a sophisticated culture along the Colorado River and its tributaries, using the desert not as an obstacle, but as a homeland. Rock art sites scattered across the Mojave include petroglyphs and pictographs of extraordinary complexity and age. The Coso Rock Art District in China Lake, which sits inside the Naval Air Weapons Station, contains one of the largest concentrations of rock art in North America, with an estimated 100,000 individual images carved or painted over a period of thousands of years. Access to this site is severely restricted because it lies inside an active military base, meaning that one of the most significant repositories of indigenous cultural heritage in the United States is largely inaccessible to the descendants of the people who created it. According to reporting in the Journal of Archaeological Science, many Mojave archaeological sites are still being discovered, suggesting the full scope of the region's human history remains unknown. Fact number 13. The Mojave Desert almost destroyed the Transcontinental Railroad before it was finished. The construction of the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad across the Mojave in the 1870s and 80s was an engineering and human ordeal of staggering proportions. Laborers, predominantly Chinese immigrants, worked in temperatures exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit, laying track across terrain that offered no shade, no water, and no mercy. Water had to be hauled in by wagon train to the work crews because no surface water existed along large sections of the route. The physical and psychological toll on the workforce was extreme, and while precise mortality records were not kept, historians estimate that hundreds of workers died during Mojave Desert construction segments. The railroad succeeded, of course, and the route it established became the foundation for Route 66 and later Interstate 40, the same corridor that today carries millions of people through the desert in air-conditioned comfort that would have been absolutely incomprehensible to the men who built the railway through that same ground a century and a half ago. Fact number 12. There is a town in the Mojave that exists solely to serve as a halfway point between nothing and nothing. Baker, California sits on Interstate 15 between Barstow and Las Vegas, and its primary economic purpose has always been to provide fuel, food, and water to travelers crossing the desert. Baker is home to the world's tallest thermometer, a sign structure standing 134 feet tall, a height that commemorates the 134-degree Fahrenheit record temperature at Death Valley. The thermometer has broken down repeatedly over the years, and there have been periods when Baker's most famous landmark stood dark and inert on the edge of the highway. The economy of Baker is entirely dependent on the flow of vehicles on Interstate 15. During the period when California implemented travel restrictions, Baker's gas stations and restaurants nearly closed permanently. The town represents something philosophically interesting about the Mojave, which is that human presence here has always been fundamentally transactional, a pit stop rather than a destination, a service economy built on the simple fact that the desert is long and people get thirsty. Fact number 11. The Mojave Desert is the birthplace of one of the most consequential environmental legal battles in American history. In the 1980s and 90s, the Mojave Desert became the central battleground over the California Desert Protection Act, which ultimately passed in 1994 and established the Mojave National Preserve, expanded Death Valley and Joshua Tree from monuments to national parks, and placed roughly 7.5 million acres of California desert under federal protection. The battle over this legislation lasted over a decade and pitted ranching, mining, and off-road vehicle interests against environmentalists, scientists, and Native American tribal groups. Senator Dianne Feinstein of California made passage of the California Desert Protection Act a personal priority and pushed it through Congress after years of legislative struggle. The creation of the Mojave National Preserve was particularly contentious because its status as a preserve rather than a park allowed existing cattle grazing and hunting to continue, a compromise that pleased almost no one completely, but was essential to getting the bill passed. The California Desert Protection Act remains one of the largest conservation measures ever enacted in American history. This is where the Mojave stops being strange and starts being haunting. Fact number 10. The Mojave Desert is sinking, not metaphorically, not slowly in some geological sense that takes millions of years. The Mojave is literally subsiding in measurable ways within human timescales, and the primary cause is groundwater extraction. As cities like Las Vegas, Barstow, and Victorville have grown, and as agricultural operations in the high desert have expanded, the aquifers beneath the Mojave have been drawn down faster than natural recharge can replace them. When underground water is removed from porous rock formations, those formations compact under the weight of the rock and soil above them. In some areas of the Mojave region, ground subsidence of over 3 feet has been recorded since the mid-20th century. According to research published using satellite interferometry data collected by the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, sections of the Coachella Valley and the eastern Mojave are among the fastest subsiding landscapes in the American West. The subsidence damages infrastructure, cracks building foundations, and is essentially irreversible. Once an aquifer compacts, it can never hold as much water again, even if it is recharged. The desert floor is falling, and the primary driver is human thirst. Fact number 9. The Mojave Desert witnessed one of the worst train disasters in California history. On March 1, 1910, a troop train carrying soldiers from San Francisco to the East Coast derailed in the desert near Barnwell, California, killing over 20 people and injuring many more. But more significant to the history of rail transport was the series of deadly accidents that occurred on the steep Cajon Pass grades, where the railroad descended from the high Mojave into the Los Angeles basin. Runaway trains, brake failures, and collisions on those grades claimed lives across multiple decades of railroad operation. The Southern Pacific and Santa Fe railroads both lost equipment and personnel to the brutal geometry of Cajon Pass, where heavily loaded freight trains could build to uncontrollable speeds on grades exceeding 3%. These disasters drove the development of improved braking technology that is still used in railroad operations today. The Mojave's geography forced engineering solutions that saved lives far beyond its boundaries. Fact number 8. The Mojave Desert is one of the largest solar energy production zones on Earth. The combination of high elevation, minimal cloud cover, and vast empty space makes the Mojave ideal for utility-scale solar energy production in ways that few other places on Earth can match. The Ivanpah Solar Electric Generating System, located near the Nevada-California border, uses 347,000 computer-controlled mirrors to focus sunlight on boilers atop 3 towers, generating up to 392 megawatts of electricity. When it opened in 2014, it was the world's largest concentrating solar thermal power plant. The Desert Sunlight Solar Farm and Genesis Solar Energy Project, both in Riverside County, add hundreds more megawatts of photovoltaic capacity. The Mojave Desert generates enough solar electricity to power millions of homes, but the development of these facilities has created genuine conflict with conservation interests because the land required for utility-scale solar is vast, and the construction process destroys desert ecosystems that recover extremely slowly, if at all. The energy transition is not frictionless, and the Mojave is where that friction is most visible. Fact number 7. The first nuclear reactor ever built to generate commercial electricity was located on the edge of the Mojave Desert. The sodium reactor experiment at the Santa Susana Field Laboratory in the Simi Hills, at the boundary of the Mojave's influence zone, was the first power reactor in the world to generate electricity for a commercial grid when it connected to the Southern California Edison network in July of 1957. The same facility later experienced a partial reactor meltdown in 1959, a fact that was classified by the federal government and not publicly acknowledged until years later. The Santa Susana Field Laboratory was also the site of rocketry testing for the Apollo program and numerous other space launch vehicles. Cleanup of radioactive and toxic chemical contamination at the site has been contested between federal agencies, the state of California, and the current property owner for decades, with completion of remediation repeatedly delayed. The birthplace of commercial nuclear power in America sits on contaminated ground at the edge of the desert that witnessed so much of the American century. Fact number 6. The Mojave Desert has a bloom event so spectacular it can be seen from space. In years of above-average winter rainfall, typically requiring at least 5 inches, concentrated in the months of December through February, the desert floor of the Mojave erupts in a phenomenon called a superbloom. Billions of wildflower seeds, some of which have lain dormant in the soil for years or even decades, germinate simultaneously and carpet the desert floor in colors of gold, purple, orange, and white. The blooms can extend for hundreds of square miles, and during exceptional superbloom events in years like 2017, they became visible in satellite imagery taken from orbit. The superbloom of 2017 drew so many visitors to the Antelope Valley, California Poppy Reserve and surrounding Mojave areas that local roads were gridlocked for miles and emergency services were overwhelmed. The ecological mechanism behind the superbloom is precise and unforgiving. The rainfall must arrive at the right time, at the right temperature, with the right interval between events. Too much or too little, too warm or too cold, and the conditions fail. The desert is not generous with beauty. It makes you wait years and then delivers everything at once. Fact number 5. I need to tell you something personal here. I drove through the Mojave on a cloudless September evening a few years ago, alone, and pulled over somewhere between Baker and Needles to watch the sunset. There were no other cars. There was no wind. The temperature was dropping from the day's high, and the air smelled like creosote and something metallic I could never name. The silence was not the absence of sound. It was a presence. It had weight. And I understood in that moment why every culture that has ever lived near a desert has made it sacred. There is nothing abstract about that feeling. It is immediate and physical and slightly frightening. The Mojave does something to you that no photograph or video can fully communicate. It makes you aware of how completely alone you actually are in the universe. And somehow, that feels exactly right. Fact number 4. The Mojave Desert was the setting for one of the most audacious government cover-ups in American history, Area 51. The classified installation located at Groom Lake in the Nevada portion of the Mojave Desert has been the subject of speculation, rumor, and documented fact since the 1950s, when the Central Intelligence Agency in the Air Force began using it to test the Lockheed U-2 high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft. Civilians in the surrounding Mojave communities reported strange lights and high-speed objects in the sky above the base throughout the Cold War era, and the government's consistent denial that anything unusual was happening at the location contributed to decades of conspiracy theories involving extraterrestrial spacecraft and alien technology. In 2013, the Central Intelligence Agency declassified documents confirming the existence of the facility and acknowledging that it was used to develop and test classified aircraft, including the U-2, the SR-71 Blackbird, and the A-12 Oxcart. The alien mythology was never officially endorsed, but the actual history of what was tested at Area 51, aircraft that flew at altitudes and speeds that seemed physically impossible to civilian observers, is almost as strange as any fictional alternative. The most classified aircraft of the 20th century were born directly above the Mojave. Fact number 3. The Mojave Desert is geologically alive in a way that most deserts are not. The Mojave sits atop a network of active fault systems that connect to the larger San Andreas fault system, and the desert has been shaped more profoundly by tectonics than by any other force. The mountains that ring the Mojave Basin, the San Bernardino Mountains, the Transverse Ranges, the Panamint Range, are still rising. The valleys between them are still dropping. Earthquakes occur across the Mojave regularly, and on June 28, 1992, the Landers earthquake struck with a magnitude of 7.3, the largest earthquake to hit the contiguous United States in 40 years at that time. The quake triggered sympathetic earthquakes as far away as Yellowstone National Park, thousands of miles to the northeast, demonstrating the geological interconnectedness of the American tectonic system. 3 hours after Landers, a second major quake struck Big Bear Lake, with a magnitude of 6.5. Geologists from the United States Geological Survey who studied the event described it as a reminder that the Mojave is not a stable landscape that merely looks ancient. It is an active geological system that is constantly, relentlessly reshaping itself. The mountains are still being built. The desert floor is still moving. The Mojave is not a finished place. Fact number 2. The Mojave Desert may be approaching an ecological tipping point from which recovery is impossible. This is not a prediction drawn from environmental advocacy, but from peer-reviewed science published in journals including Ecology and Global Change Biology. The combination of rising temperatures driven by climate change, groundwater depletion, invasive species establishing irreversible footholds, increased wildfire frequency due to that invasive grass and plant cover, habitat fragmentation from development and military activity, solar energy infrastructure construction, and decreasing snowpack in the surrounding mountains that feeds desert aquifers represents a convergence of pressures that no desert ecosystem has faced simultaneously in recorded history. Individual stressors are survivable. The Mojave has endured catastrophic drought cycles, volcanic activity, ice age climate shifts, and human occupation for 10,000 years. But the current combination of pressures is novel in its simultaneity and its speed. The Joshua trees that define this landscape require specific temperature and moisture conditions to reproduce, and climate projections suggest those conditions will become rare across most of the current Mojave Range within decades. The desert is changing faster than it can adapt, and the window to alter that trajectory is measured not in centuries, but in years. Fact number 1. Everything about the Mojave that seems like a problem, the heat, the emptiness, the extremity, the harshness, is precisely what has made it the most consequential desert in American history. Think back to what we said at the beginning. 57,000 square miles that most people dismiss as nothing between 2 points. But that nothing is where the sound barrier was broken. It is where the space age began. It is where nuclear weapons were tested and where commercial nuclear power was born. It is where the solar energy economy is being built. It is where indigenous people lived for 10,000 years in intimate partnership with conditions that kill the unprepared in hours. It is where the rarest organisms on Earth found the perfect conditions to survive 5,000 years. It is where underground rivers flow beneath dry sand and mountains are still rising from the ground. The Mojave is not empty. It is the opposite of empty. It has simply been misread by everyone who was only passing through. The people who stopped, who listened, who paid attention, they found something that cannot be found anywhere else on this planet. A place where the Earth is still doing everything it has always done, unmediated, undisguised, without apology. That is what the Mojave actually is. So here's my question for you. If you could spend one night anywhere in the Mojave Desert, completely alone, no technology, no agenda, just you and 60 million years of geological history, where would you choose? The booming dunes at Kelso? The shoreline of Death Valley, where an ancient lake once was? The bristlecone forest at 11,000 feet, where trees older than Egyptian civilization are still growing? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this video gave you even one fact that genuinely surprised you, which I am betting it did, share it with someone who thinks the desert is just a place you drive through to get somewhere else. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into the places that the world keeps getting wrong. I am going to keep digging into landscapes that deserve a closer look, and I will see you in the next one.